"And this," my daughter-in-law said with a bright smile as she lifted her wine glass toward me, "is the unbearable one in the family." Everyone around the Thanksgiving table laughed softly, the kind of uncomfortable laughter people use when they know something is cruel but don't want to admit it out loud. I smiled back anyway. I even nodded politely, as if I were part of the joke too. But the truth is, something inside me went very still in that moment. The Carter family Thanksgiving dinner had always been my favorite holiday tradition. Even after my husband Thomas passed away 6 years earlier, I still baked the same pumpkin pies from scratch, still folded cloth napkins carefully, still brought homemade cranberry sauce, because my son Michael used to love it as a boy. At 69 years old, traditions were the closest thing I had to holding a family together. Vanessa hosted Thanksgiving now, of course. She made sure everyone knew that. Her house looked like something from a magazine spread, every candle perfectly placed, every white plate lined neatly on the dark oak table. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and expensive perfume. Outside, cold November rain tapped softly against the windows while warm yellow lights reflected across crystal glasses. It should have felt comforting. Instead, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome years ago. "Mom brought her famous pie," Michael announced as I set the carrier down near the kitchen island. His voice sounded distracted, automatic. Vanessa barely glanced at it before smiling tightly. "That's sweet," she said, although Olivia already brought dessert from that bakery downtown. "You know, the fancy one everybody likes." I quietly removed my coat and placed it over the back of a chair. "I'm sure there's room for both," I said gently. Vanessa laughed under her breath. "There always is with Evelyn." I pretended not to hear it. That had become a skill of mine over the years. Pretending not to hear things. Pretending not to notice the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. Pretending not to notice family photos online from gatherings I was never invited to. Pretending not to notice that every holiday somehow revolved around Vanessa's rules now. Dinner began an hour later. The long dining table was beautiful, decorated with eucalyptus branches and tiny gold pumpkins scattered between candles. Vanessa stood beside Michael at the head of the table, holding a glass of red wine while everyone settled into their seats. "Before we eat," she said brightly, "I thought it would be fun to introduce everyone the way we really are." Olivia shifted uncomfortably beside me. She was Michael's niece, 26 years old, quiet but observant. I had always liked her because she still looked people directly in the eyes when they spoke. Vanessa pointed around the table dramatically. "This is Robert, the family financial genius," she said, earning a chuckle from Michael's brother-in-law. "And this is Claire, our health nut who judges every carb on the table." More laughter followed. Then Vanessa placed one manicured hand lightly on my shoulder. "And this," she announced, smiling wider than before, "is Evelyn, the unbearable one." The room froze for half a second before nervous laughter spread across the table. Someone coughed. Someone else stared down into their mashed potatoes. Michael laughed too. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Enough for me to feel it settle heavily in my chest. Vanessa sipped her wine calmly, as though she'd simply made a harmless joke. "You know I'm kidding," she added. "Evelyn just likes things done her way." I folded my hands carefully in my lap so nobody would see them tremble. "Well," I said softly, forcing a smile, "after almost 70 years, I suppose everyone becomes a little difficult." Vanessa smirked like she had won something. Dinner continued after that, but I barely tasted the food on my plate. Around me, forks clinked against china while conversation flowed easily between everyone else. Michael talked about work bonuses. Vanessa described a ski trip they were planning for Christmas. Nobody asked me a single question. At one point I realized I had been cutting the same piece of turkey for nearly a minute without taking a bite. Across the table, Olivia noticed. She kept glancing toward Vanessa with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity maybe, or guilt. I focused instead on the candlelight flickering against the windows. Thomas used to sit beside me during Thanksgiving dinners and squeeze my hand under the table whenever family tension started rising. "Ignore the noise," he would whisper later while helping me wash dishes. "People reveal themselves eventually." Back then, I thought he meant strangers. I never imagined he meant our own family. "Evelyn." Vanessa's voice interrupted my thoughts. "You've barely touched your food. Don't tell me the unbearable one suddenly lost her appetite." More laughter followed. Softer this time. Careful. Controlled. I smiled again because dignity was sometimes the only thing a woman my age had left. I'm just tired, I answered quietly. Long drive in the rain. Michael finally looked at me then, though only briefly. You should have stayed home if you weren't feeling up to it, Mom. The words hit harder than Vanessa's joke, because cruelty from Vanessa no longer surprised me, but indifference from my own son still did. I lowered my eyes to my untouched plate and nodded slowly. Maybe you're right, I whispered. What none of them knew was that this would be the last Thanksgiving I ever spent begging silently for a seat at their table. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled into my driveway that night, but the cold seemed to follow me inside the house anyway. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment without turning on the lights, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. 34 years earlier, Thomas had hung that clock crookedly while laughing because he refused to read instructions. I used to complain about it being uneven. Now I could not imagine straightening it. I slowly placed the untouched pumpkin pie on the counter and slipped off my shoes. My feet ached from sitting tense at that dinner table for hours pretending everything was normal. That was the exhausting part about humiliation at my age. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was small and constant, like carrying a stone in your pocket every single day until you forgot what it felt like to walk without the weight. I poured myself a cup of tea, even though it was almost midnight. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon candles and old books. Safe smells. Familiar smells. I wrapped both hands around the mug and sat alone at the kitchen table where Thomas and I used to drink coffee every morning before work. Back then, Michael would come running downstairs in mismatched socks asking for pancakes before school. He used to hug me without embarrassment. He used to call every Sunday afternoon just to talk. Somewhere along the years after Vanessa entered his life, those calls became shorter, then occasional, then holidays only. And even during holidays, he looked distracted, as though being near me required emotional effort. I used to tell myself that marriage changed people, that work stress changed people, that adulthood simply made families drift apart naturally. But sitting there in the silence after Thanksgiving dinner, I realized something painful. Families do not drift apart overnight. They disappear inch by inch. One ignored phone call, one forgotten invitation, one joke at someone else's expense. One chair slowly moved farther from the center of the table. I opened my phone and stared at the family photos already posted online from dinner less than an hour earlier. Vanessa worked quickly. In every picture, she stood in the middle smiling brightly while everyone gathered around her. Michael had his arm around her waist in nearly every shot. Olivia appeared near the edge of the frame, looking uncomfortable. And me? In the only photo I appeared in, I was blurred slightly in the background reaching for my purse, while everyone else laughed at something off camera. I studied the image longer than I should have. It struck me then that I looked exactly how I had felt all evening. Temporary. Disposable. Like someone accidentally left in the picture. I set the phone face down on the table and closed my eyes. Memories started surfacing quietly after that. Small moments I had ignored for years because acknowledging them would have hurt too much. 3 Christmases ago when Vanessa changed the dinner time without telling me and acted surprised when I arrived late. The year before that when family vacation photos appeared online from a lake house trip I had never heard about. Last spring when Michael forgot my birthday entirely until Olivia reminded him 2 days later. You know how busy life gets, Mom, he had said apologetically over the phone. I remember standing in the grocery store parking lot holding a bouquet of flowers I had bought myself because nobody else had. At the time I convinced myself it did not matter. Tonight it suddenly mattered very much. I walked slowly into the living room and turned on the small lamp beside Thomas's old recliner. His reading glasses still rested on the side table exactly where he left them before his final hospital stay. Sometimes people asked why I had never moved them. The truth was simple. Grief is strange. Certain objects stop being objects after loss. They become proof that love once lived in a room. I sat down carefully and pulled a knitted blanket over my legs. Outside, wet leaves blew softly across the porch beneath the streetlight. For the first time all evening, I let myself replay Vanessa's words exactly as she had said them. The unbearable one. Not difficult. Not stubborn. Unbearable. A word meant for someone people tolerated out of obligation. What hurt most was not even the insult itself. It was how natural it sounded coming from her mouth. Like she had said it many times before when I was not around. I wondered suddenly how often my name came up in conversations after I left rooms. How many stories had been told about me over cocktails and vacations and family dinners I no longer attended? How carefully had Vanessa built this version of me for everyone else to believe? A burden. Too sensitive. Hard to please. The aging mother-in-law nobody really wanted around. My chest tightened unexpectedly then, not from anger, but from embarrassment. Because some part of me had spent years trying to earn my way back into a family that had already quietly decided who I was. Around 1 a.m, my phone buzzed softly on the coffee table. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another holiday photo notification. But when I looked down, I saw Olivia's name appear across the screen. I hesitated before opening the message. "I am sorry about tonight," it read. "You did not deserve that." I stared at those words for a very long time. They were simple words. Small words. But after years of silence from everyone else, they felt almost shocking. Someone had noticed. Someone had finally noticed. I did not answer Olivia's message that night. Not because I was upset with her, but because I no longer trusted my own emotions after family gatherings. Everything felt fragile after evenings like that, as though one wrong word might cause years of carefully controlled sadness to spill out all at once. Instead, I placed my phone face down beside the lamp and sat quietly beneath the soft yellow light in my living room until nearly 2 a.m. The next few days passed slowly. Thanksgiving decorations still hung from porches around the neighborhood, while Christmas lights began appearing one house at a time. Every morning, I followed the same routine I had followed for years. I woke at 6:30, made coffee in the old drip machine Thomas refused to replace, watered the small plants above the kitchen sink, and read the local paper while soft jazz played quietly from the radio. From the outside, my life probably looked peaceful. A tidy white house, a retired school librarian, a widow who baked too much and kept bird feeders filled year-round. But loneliness has a way of settling into ordinary routines until they stop feeling comforting and start feeling rehearsed. On Sunday afternoon, I drove to the grocery store for soup ingredients and wrapping paper. Near the produce section, I unexpectedly spotted Vanessa speaking with 2 women from her church group. I almost turned the cart around before she noticed me, but it was too late. "Evelyn," she called brightly, her voice polished instantly. Both women turned toward me with pleasant smiles that felt practiced. Vanessa stepped forward and kissed the air beside my cheek, without actually touching me. "I was just telling them how stubborn you are about letting anyone help you." She laughed softly. "She refuses to slow down. We keep telling her she should move closer to us." One of the women smiled sympathetically. "That is wonderful. Your son takes such good care of you." I looked directly at Vanessa then. She smiled sweetly back at me while adjusting the expensive scarf around her neck. It struck me suddenly how talented she was at creating versions of reality. In her version, she was the caring daughter-in-law trying her best with a difficult older woman. In her version, every exclusion was concern. Every insult was humor. Every manipulation was love disguised as patience. "Michael is very busy," I said calmly. "I try not to become a burden." Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. "See," she laughed to the women. "She always says things like that." The women chuckled politely while I stood there holding a bag of onions in complete silence. I realized then that Vanessa did not humiliate me only in private family moments. She had been quietly building this narrative everywhere. At church, at dinners, at neighborhood parties I no longer attended. Little comments planted carefully over time until people stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a personality trait. Difficult, sensitive, old-fashioned, the unbearable one. I finished shopping quickly after that and drove home beneath dark gray clouds that threatened snow. The radio played Christmas commercials while traffic crawled along Main Street. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the windshield. Silver hair tucked neatly beneath my coat collar. Tired blue eyes. Lips pressed together too often. I suddenly wondered when I had started shrinking myself around other people just to avoid becoming inconvenient. By Tuesday evening, Olivia texted again. "Can I stop by for a few minutes?" I hesitated before replying yes. An hour later, she arrived carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery downtown. She looked nervous standing on my porch, shifting slightly in the cold December wind while strands of dark hair escaped from her knit hat. "I hope this is okay," she said softly as I let her inside. "I remembered you liked cinnamon rolls." "That was your Uncle Thomas," I corrected gently while taking the bag from her hands. "I only ate them because he loved them." Olivia smiled sadly. I miss him too. We sat in the kitchen, while snow began falling lightly outside the windows. For a while we talked about harmless things. Her work at the architecture firm, my neighbor's overly dramatic golden retriever, the Christmas market downtown. But eventually silence settled between us in that heavy silence sometimes does when both people know the real conversation has not started yet. Olivia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before finally speaking. I should have said something at Thanksgiving, she whispered. I looked down at the steam rising from my tea. It would not have changed much. Maybe not, she said carefully. But it still was not right. I nodded slowly but said nothing. Olivia took a deep breath after that, as though deciding something internally. Aunt Vanessa talks about you differently when you are not around, she admitted quietly. And honestly, sometimes Uncle Michael just lets it happen. The words should not have surprised me. Still, hearing them spoken aloud felt strangely painful. Real pain is often quieter once someone finally confirms it. What kinds of things? I asked softly. Olivia hesitated. She says you make everything about yourself. That you guilt people. That family events are easier when you leave early. I stared down at the table for several long seconds. Somewhere outside, wind rattled softly against the porch railing. Do people believe her? I finally asked. Olivia looked genuinely heartbroken by the question. I think people stop questioning her because she says everything with a smile. After Olivia left that evening, I remained at the kitchen table long after her car disappeared from the street. The snow outside had thickened, covering the neighborhood in soft white silence. Christmas lights glowed faintly through frosted windows across the block, while my tea turned cold beside me untouched. People stop questioning her because she says everything with a smile. I kept replaying that sentence in my head. It explained more than I wanted it to. Vanessa had never openly screamed at me or caused scenes the way difficult people do in movies. Her cruelty operated quietly, elegantly, carefully wrapped in charm and concern. Looking back, now, I realized she had spent years editing me out of my own family one polite comment at a time. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway closet where old photo albums were stacked in faded boxes. I had not opened most of them since Thomas died. Dust coated the corners of the blue leather album I finally carried back to the living room. The pages smelled faintly of paper and age as I turned through decades of photographs. Michael at 8 years old holding a fishing pole beside Thomas at Lake Monroe. Christmas mornings in matching pajamas. School graduations. Birthday cakes. Summer barbecues in our backyard before life became complicated. Then eventually the photographs changed. Vanessa appeared. At first, she seemed warm and effortless. Beautiful in that polished magazine way people admire immediately. I still remembered the first dinner she attended at our house, nearly 15 years earlier. She brought an expensive bottle of wine and complimented everything I cooked. Michael told me you make the best roast chicken in the state. She had laughed sweetly while helping clear plates afterward. Thomas liked her immediately. So did I. For a long time, I blamed myself for what happened afterward because the changes came so gradually, I barely noticed them. Vanessa never demanded attention directly. She redirected it. Family dinners slowly moved to her house because her kitchen was larger. Holiday plans changed because her schedule was so hectic. Phone calls with Michael became shorter because Vanessa was always in the background needing something. Looking through those photographs now felt like watching someone slowly disappear from their own life. In newer pictures, I stood farther from the center each year. Sometimes I was missing entirely. I paused at a photo from 6 years earlier taken during Michael and Vanessa's 4th of July barbecue. Everyone stood smiling beneath strings of patio lights while fireworks exploded somewhere beyond the trees. I remembered that evening clearly now. Vanessa had introduced me to one of Michael's co-workers as our family historian because Evelyn remembers absolutely everything and never lets anyone forget it. Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too at the time. But later that night, Thomas squeezed my hand quietly while helping load dishes into the dishwasher. That bothered you, he had said softly. It was just a joke, I answered automatically. He looked at me for a long moment before replying. Not all jokes are harmless. Back then I still believed things would improve eventually. Thomas did not. Near the back of the album, an envelope slipped loose and fell onto the carpet beside my chair. I picked it up carefully, recognizing Thomas's handwriting immediately. My chest tightened unexpectedly. I had forgotten this letter existed. The paper inside was folded neatly despite yellowed edges from age. Evie, It began in the messy cursive I knew by heart. If you are reading this one day after I am gone, then I need you to remember something important. You spend too much time trying to make other people comfortable even when they are hurting you. Especially Michael. Especially Vanessa. I stopped breathing for a moment. Snow continued drifting silently outside, while the grandfather clock ticked steadily from the hallway. My hands trembled slightly as I kept reading. I have watched you excuse disrespect for years because you are afraid of losing your family. But love that only survives when you stay silent is not real love. One day you are going to realize you deserve peace more than approval. Tears blurred the page suddenly, and I pressed my fingers carefully against my eyes. Thomas wrote this during the final months of his illness. Back then, I thought his frustration with Michael came from stress and fear about dying. Now I wondered how much he had quietly noticed while I kept pretending everything was fine. The next morning I woke earlier than usual after barely sleeping. By 8 o'clock, I was already wrapping Christmas gifts in the dining room, while old Frank Sinatra songs played softly from the radio. Halfway through taping a ribbon onto Olivia's present, my phone rang unexpectedly. Michael. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. Hi, Mom, he said quickly. His tone sounded distracted, rushed. Vanessa and I are planning Christmas dinner. Already. We figured it would be easier if everyone came here again. Easier. That word again. Family events had apparently become logistical problems now instead of gatherings. That sounds lovely, I replied calmly. Good, he said. Oh, and Vanessa thought maybe this year we could keep things light. You know how tense Thanksgiving got. I sat perfectly still at the table while ribbon curled loosely beside my hands. Did it? I asked quietly. Michael exhaled awkwardly. Mom, come on. Vanessa was joking. You always take things personally. There it was again. The familiar rewriting of reality. The same careful dismissal Olivia described. I looked across the dining room toward the framed photograph of Thomas smiling beside our old maple tree. For the first time in years, something inside me did not collapse inward after hearing Michael defend her. Instead, something colder settled quietly into place. Clarity. Clarity is a strange thing when it arrives late in life. It does not come with dramatic music or shouting or sudden revenge. It comes quietly, usually while standing in your kitchen holding a dish towel or listening to someone disappoint you for the 100th time. After my conversation with Michael ended, I sat alone in the dining room staring at the half-wrapped Christmas presents scattered across the table. Outside, snow rested heavily against the windowsills while pale morning light stretched across the hardwood floor. I thought I would cry after hearing him defend Vanessa again. Instead, I felt tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes. The kind that settles into your bones after years of explaining away disrespect because you love people too much to see them clearly. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery for the first time in nearly 3 months. Thomas always hated cold weather, yet somehow the cemetery looked peaceful beneath the fresh snow. I stood beside his headstone with my gloved hands tucked tightly into my coat pockets while icy wind moved softly through the bare trees around me. You were right, I whispered finally. Saying the words out loud made my chest ache unexpectedly. A few snowflakes landed against the bouquet of white carnations I had brought with me. Thomas used to buy carnations for me every anniversary because he claimed roses looked too formal. Flowers should look cheerful, he always said. I stared down at his name carved into the stone and suddenly remembered something I had not thought about in years. About 8 months before he died, Thomas spent nearly 2 entire weekends reorganizing paperwork in the garage office. At the time, I teased him for turning filing cabinets into a retirement hobby. He only smiled and said he wanted things simplified in case I ever needed help later. Back then, I assumed he meant ordinary things. Bank accounts, insurance forms, house repairs. But standing there in the cold cemetery, another memory surfaced quietly behind it. One evening after dinner, Thomas asked me very directly, if something happens to me, would you ever let Michael pressure you into selling this house? I remember laughing softly at the question because it sounded absurd. Why would Michael pressure me? I asked. Thomas did not answer immediately. He just stared out the kitchen window for several seconds before saying, because sometimes people change once they start seeing a home as property instead of memories. At the time, I thought grief medication and hospital stress had made him overly suspicious. Now I was not so sure. When I returned home later that afternoon, I parked in the driveway without going inside immediately. My house sat quietly beneath the gray December sky with snow covering the porch railing and wreaths hanging from nearby windows along the street. Thomas and I bought this place 37 years earlier when Michael was 5 years old. Back then, the kitchen wallpaper was yellow and the roof leaked whenever it rained hard. We spent years fixing everything together, one paycheck at a time. Every corner of that house carried part of our life inside it. Birthday dinners, homework at the kitchen counter, arguments, Christmas mornings, illness, recovery, love. You cannot measure a home like that in square footage and market value, though people often try. I finally stepped inside and removed my coat slowly beside the front door. The house smelled faintly like cedar from the Christmas tree in the living room. For the first time in weeks, instead of sitting down immediately, I walked toward the garage. Dust floated softly through pale afternoon light as I opened old storage cabinets one at a time. Holiday decorations, toolboxes, paint cans, filing drawers. Near the back wall sat the metal cabinet Thomas used during his final year organizing paperwork. I hesitated before unlocking it with the small silver key still hanging inside the kitchen junk drawer. Most of the folders held ordinary things exactly as expected. Utility records, tax returns, insurance documents. But near the bottom drawer, I noticed a thick brown envelope labeled in Thomas's handwriting. For Evelyn only. My pulse quickened unexpectedly as I carried the envelope inside to the kitchen table. The papers inside looked official. Legal documents, property records, trust information. Several pages clipped neatly together with handwritten notes in the margins. I read slowly, carefully, while the winter sun faded outside the windows. Halfway through the documents, I stopped breathing for a moment altogether. Thomas had placed the house into a protected family trust 2 years before he died. The terms were detailed and unmistakably intentional. As long as I remained living in the home voluntarily, no one could force its sale or transfer ownership without my consent. There was more, much more. If evidence ever showed coercion, manipulation, or emotional pressure intended to remove me from the property, the trust automatically transferred controlling authority away from direct family beneficiaries entirely. My hands trembled slightly against the paper. Thomas knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to prepare quietly. Enough to protect me in ways I never realized. Tucked inside the folder was one final handwritten note. Evie, if you are reading this because someone is making you feel unwanted in your own home, then remember this house belongs to your life, not their convenience. Tears blurred my vision then, but this time they felt different. Not helpless, not ashamed. Across the kitchen counter, my phone buzzed softly with a new message. Vanessa, do not forget Christmas Eve dinner starts at 5 sharp this year. We really need everyone on time. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before setting the phone back down carefully beside Thomas's papers. For the first time in years, I did not feel afraid walking into one of Vanessa's carefully staged family gatherings. Because suddenly I understood something she never expected me to understand. I was never as powerless as she wanted me to believe. The week before Christmas arrived with freezing rain and crowded grocery stores, and the kind of forced cheerfulness that makes lonely people feel even lonelier. Every house on my street glowed with lights after dark, while delivery trucks moved constantly through the neighborhood dropping packages on its snowy porches. Normally, I loved this time of year. I used to spend entire afternoons baking cookies while old holiday records played in the background. But that December felt different. Not sad exactly. Sharper somehow. Like waking up after years of slowly drifting asleep. I kept Thomas's trust documents locked inside the dining room drawer beneath old stationery and unopened Christmas cards. Every few hours I found myself rereading certain sections just to reassure myself they were real. The legal language was precise and cold, but beneath it I could still hear Thomas's voice. Calm, prepared, protective. I realized now that he had spent his final years quietly observing dynamics I refused to fully acknowledge. That realization hurt more than I expected, not because he saw the truth, but because I had forced him to watch me tolerate it. On the Tuesday before Christmas Eve, Olivia stopped by again carrying containers of soup from a cafe downtown. Snow clung to the shoulders of her dark wool coat as she stepped inside. I figured you forgot to eat lunch again, she said gently while placing the bags on the kitchen counter. You sound like Thomas, I replied softly before I could stop myself. Olivia smiled sadly at that. We ate quietly for a while at the kitchen table, while soft instrumental Christmas music played from the radio. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythms. Eventually, Olivia set her spoon down carefully and looked at me with unusual seriousness. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking again. "Has Uncle Michael talked to you about selling this house?" I felt my stomach tighten immediately, though my expression remained calm. "Why would you ask that?" Olivia looked uncomfortable suddenly, as though she regretted bringing it up. "I overheard something after Thanksgiving," she admitted quietly. "Aunt Vanessa was talking to someone in the kitchen after dinner. I do not think she realized I was upstairs." I waited silently. Olivia lowered her voice slightly, even though we were completely alone. She said once you moved into a smaller place, they could finally renovate this property or sell it. The room felt very still after that. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, while steam rose slowly from our soup bowls. "Did Michael say anything?" I asked carefully. Olivia stared down at the table for several seconds before answering. "Not really. But he did not disagree either. For some reason, that hurt less than it would have a month earlier. Maybe because disappointment loses some of its power once you stop fighting reality." "There is more," Olivia admitted softly. "Aunt Vanessa has been telling people you struggle living alone. She keeps saying she worries about your memory and that you are becoming isolated." I almost laughed hearing that. Not because it was funny, but because it was so calculated. Vanessa understood something dangerous about people. If you repeat concern often enough, eventually nobody questions the cruelty hiding underneath it. "Did she say that at church too?" I asked. Olivia nodded slowly. "And to some extended family members." I leaned back quietly in my chair while cold rain streaked across the kitchen windows. Suddenly, dozens of strange conversations from the past few years rearranged themselves into a clearer picture. Relatives asking whether I felt safe driving alone now. Friends mentioning how thoughtful Vanessa seemed for checking on me so often. Michael casually suggesting one-story condos near his neighborhood during random conversations. They had been preparing the narrative for years. Not openly, patiently, carefully. Evelyn would be happier somewhere smaller. We just want what is best for her. She gets overwhelmed easily now. None of it sounded cruel when spoken aloud. That was what made it effective. Olivia looked heartbroken watching me process everything silently. "I am sorry," she whispered. I reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "You have nothing to apologize for." But internally, something cold and undeniable continued settling into place. For years I believed I was fighting to remain emotionally included in my family. Now I realized I had also been quietly defending my place inside my own life. 2 days later, Michael called unexpectedly while I was wrapping presents in the living room. "Hey Mom," he said quickly. "Quick question. Vanessa and I were wondering if you still had copies of Dad's old property paperwork somewhere." I looked down slowly at the scissors resting beside Thomas's trust documents hidden beneath a stack of wrapping paper. "Why?" I asked evenly. "Oh, nothing major," Michael answered too casually. "Vanessa just thought it might be smart to organize things early in case you ever decide to downsize." Downsize. Such a harmless-sounding word for something that suddenly felt very ugly. I stared at the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner of the room while memories crowded my chest. Michael taking his first steps across this carpet. Thomas asleep in his recliner after long workdays. Birthday parties. Snowstorms. Piano recitals. Decades of ordinary life compressed into walls and windows and hardwood floors. "I am not planning to leave this house," I said calmly. Silence followed briefly on the other end. "Nobody said you had to," Michael replied, though his tone had shifted slightly colder. "We are just trying to help you think ahead." I closed my eyes for a moment. Help, concern, support. Everything always sounded loving once Vanessa arranged the wording properly. "I appreciate the thought," I answered quietly. "But your father already planned ahead for me." Another pause followed. Longer this time. "What does that mean?" Michael asked carefully. I looked toward the drawer holding Thomas's trust documents and felt something unfamiliar settle deep inside me. Confidence. "It means your father made sure I would always have a home," I said softly. Then I wished him a Merry Christmas and ended the call before he could respond. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in freezing wind and soft gray skies. By late afternoon, Snow had started falling again in slow, heavy flakes that covered the streets and rooftops with fresh white silence. I stood in my bedroom, carefully fastening a pair of pearl earrings Thomas gave me on our 30th anniversary, while distant church bells echoed faintly across town. In the mirror, I studied my reflection longer than usual. Dark green wool coat, silver hair softly curled, calm expression. For years before family gatherings, I used to prepare myself emotionally like someone bracing for bad weather. I would rehearse conversations in advance, remind myself not to overreact, promise myself to stay agreeable no matter what happened. But that Christmas Eve felt different. I no longer needed their approval badly enough to fear losing it. Before leaving the house, I walked once through the quiet living room and paused beside the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner. Beneath it sat wrapped presents for Michael and Olivia. I almost left Michael's gift behind. Then I picked it up anyway because kindness reflected who I was, not who he had become. The drive to Michael and Vanessa's house took 20 minutes through slow holiday traffic. Everywhere I looked, families moved warmly through brightly lit restaurants and church entrances bundled in scarves and heavy coats. Christmas music played softly from the radio while windshield wipers brushed snow aside in steady rhythms. When I finally pulled into Michael's driveway, I noticed more cars than expected already parked outside. Too many for a normal family dinner. My stomach tightened quietly. Vanessa opened the front door before I even reached the porch. "Evelyn," she greeted brightly with theatrical warmth. "You made it through the weather." Her red dress looked elegant and expensive beneath the glow of the entryway lights. Behind her, laughter drifted from the dining room along with the scent of cinnamon candles and roasted ham. Traffic was slow, I replied calmly while removing my gloves. Vanessa kissed the air beside my cheek again without touching me. "Everyone is already here," she said. Even Richard and Melissa stopped by unexpectedly. Unexpectedly. Another lie. Vanessa never did anything unexpectedly. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed someone else standing near the fireplace, speaking quietly with Michael. A man in a navy overcoat, holding a leather portfolio. Late 50s. Polished smile. Realtor. The realization landed instantly, and without confusion. They were not even trying to hide it anymore. Michael looked visibly startled when he noticed me observing the man. "Mom," he said quickly while walking over. "This is Greg Turner. He is a family friend of Vanessa's cousin." Greg extended his hand smoothly. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carter." I shook his hand politely while holding Michael's eyes for one brief moment longer than usual. He looked away first. "Greg works in real estate," Vanessa added too casually while taking my coat. "We were all just talking about how crazy housing prices have become lately." Of course they were. I smiled faintly. "I imagine that keeps him busy." Vanessa's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, as though my calmness disappointed her somehow. Dinner began shortly afterward beneath warm golden lights and carefully arranged holiday decorations. Crystal glasses sparkled against white table linens, while soft jazz played from hidden speakers somewhere in the house. Everything looked beautiful. Vanessa always understood presentation. That was part of what made her dangerous. She knew how to create environments where other people doubted uncomfortable truths because the surface looked too perfect to question. I took my seat near the far end of the table beside Olivia, who looked tense the moment she saw Greg Turner. She leaned closer toward me while everyone settled into their chairs. "I did not know he would be here," she whispered quietly. "But now I understand why Aunt Vanessa kept asking whether you were bringing paperwork tonight." I turned slightly toward her. "What paperwork?" Olivia looked uneasy immediately after speaking. "She mentioned earlier this week that Uncle Michael needed to discuss some future planning with you. I thought maybe it was medical paperwork or insurance." Future planning. Another carefully sanitized phrase. Across the table, Vanessa raised her wine glass with practiced elegance. "I just want to say how grateful I am that we can all spend another Christmas together as a family," she announced warmly. "Especially because life changes so quickly and we never know when people might need more support than they used to." Several relatives nodded sympathetically while I quietly buttered a dinner roll beside my plate. Vanessa continued smiling directly at me. "It is important to have difficult conversations before emergencies happen." There it was. Not direct enough to seem cruel. Just enough to plant concern into the room. I glanced briefly toward Michael. He remained focused on his wine glass. Olivia sat stiffly beside me, gripping her napkin tightly in her lap. "I completely agree. I said calmly before taking a sip of water. Vanessa blinked once, surprised by how easily I answered. Throughout dinner, the conversation kept circling strangely around aging, retirement communities, healthcare costs, and downsizing homes after widowhood. Greg contributed frequently, always sounding helpful and professional. Many seniors feel relieved once they simplify their living situations, he explained smoothly at one point. Large homes become emotional burdens eventually. Emotional burdens. I almost smiled hearing the phrase. Across the table, Vanessa watched me carefully while cutting her ham into tiny, perfect bites. She was waiting for embarrassment, waiting for emotional collapse, waiting for me to become defensive so everyone else would view her concern as reasonable. But instead, I simply listened quietly while snow continued falling beyond the dining room windows. Halfway through dessert, Olivia suddenly set her fork down harder than intended. The sharp sound against the china plate cut briefly through the room's soft conversation. Vanessa looked over immediately. "Everything all right?" she asked sweetly. Olivia stared directly at her aunt for several long seconds before answering. "Actually," she said carefully, "I think some people here should stop pretending this dinner is about concern when it is obviously about something else." The entire table fell silent. The silence after Olivia spoke felt so complete I could hear the faint crackling of the fireplace from the next room. Snow continued drifting quietly outside the dining room windows while everyone at the table froze beneath the warm glow of Christmas lights and candlelight. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. She gave a small laugh and reached for her wineglass with polished calmness. "Olivia," she said lightly, "you are being dramatic." But Olivia did not back down. For the first time since I had known her as a shy little girl following relatives around at family cookouts, she looked completely certain of herself. "No," she replied quietly. "I'm just tired of watching everyone pretend." Michael shifted uncomfortably beside Vanessa. "Olivia, this is not the time," he muttered. "Actually," Olivia said while looking directly at him, "I think this is exactly the time." The room remained painfully still. Even Greg Turner stared awkwardly into his water glass now, suddenly realizing he had walked into something much larger than a routine holiday dinner. Vanessa placed her napkin carefully beside her plate. Her smile remained intact, but I noticed something colder beginning to surface beneath it. Irritation. "I have no idea what you think is happening here," she said evenly. Olivia let out a soft breath through her nose like someone finally exhausted from holding silence too long. "You want everyone to think Evelyn cannot manage her life anymore," she said plainly. "You have been saying it for years." Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vanessa laughed again, though this time the sound landed sharply against the room. "Concern is not manipulation," she replied. "Someone has to think practically." Olivia turned toward the others at the table. "Did any of you know she has been telling people Evelyn forgets things? That she struggles living alone? That she needs supervision?" Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. "I never said supervision." "You implied it," Olivia answered calmly. Michael rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Can we please not do this tonight?" he said quietly. But Olivia continued speaking before Vanessa could regain control of the conversation. "After Thanksgiving, I overheard Vanessa telling someone that once Evelyn moved out, they could finally renovate or sell her house." The words settled heavily across the table. Vanessa stared at Olivia with open disbelief now. "You were eavesdropping?" she snapped. "No," Olivia replied softly. "You just never noticed who was around because you assumed nobody would question you." I remained completely still through all of it. Not because I felt weak anymore, but because something profound happens when the truth finally begins speaking for itself. You stop needing to defend your pain. Vanessa looked toward the relatives around the table, searching for support. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "Everything Michael and I have done has been out of concern for Evelyn." "Concern?" Olivia repeated quietly. "Is that what you call introducing her as unbearable at Thanksgiving?" Several people looked down immediately after hearing that aloud. Vanessa's face changed slightly then. Not embarrassment. Calculation. She glanced toward Michael, expecting him to restore control the way he always had before. For years, he probably would have. But Michael looked shaken now. Exhausted. Cornered by realities he spent too long avoiding. "Vanessa," he said carefully. "Maybe some of the jokes did go too far." Her head turned toward him instantly. "Excuse me," she whispered. The room seemed to shrink around that single word. Michael swallowed hard. I am just saying maybe Mom felt hurt sometimes. Sometimes. Such a small word for years of humiliation. Vanessa stared at him in complete disbelief before letting out a cold laugh under her breath. Unbelievable, she muttered. Now suddenly I am the villain because I tried to help organize this family? Olivia shook her head slowly. No. You became the villain when you started controlling how everyone saw her. Vanessa stood abruptly from the table then, the legs of her chair scraping sharply against the hardwood floor. This is absurd, she snapped. Evelyn has manipulated everyone with guilt for years, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. For the first time all evening, every eye in the room turned fully toward me. The old version of myself would have rushed to calm everyone down. I would have apologized for tension I did not create just to restore peace. But sitting there beneath the soft glow of Christmas candles while snow fell quietly outside, I suddenly felt completely calm. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked up at Vanessa steadily. You know, I said softly, for a long time I believed if I stayed quiet enough, eventually you would stop treating me like a problem. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. Evelyn, nobody is treating you like a problem. I held her gaze gently. You introduced me to my own family as unbearable. Silence answered me. Even Vanessa could not smooth that sentence into something harmless anymore. I continued quietly. What hurt most was not the joke itself. It was realizing nobody expected me to defend myself. Michael looked down immediately after hearing that. His face had gone pale beneath the warm dining room lights. Mom, he started softly, but I raised one hand slightly, and he stopped speaking. I spent years thinking I needed to earn comfort at family tables, I said calmly, as though love became something conditional once I grew older. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Across from me, Greg Turner looked deeply uncomfortable now, his untouched dessert sitting forgotten beside his plate. Vanessa's anger seemed to flicker uncertainly for the first time all evening because the room had shifted against her. Not loudly, quietly, irreversibly. Olivia reached gently for my hand beneath the table. I squeezed her softly in return. Then I looked toward Michael one final time. Your father spent his final years making sure I would never lose my home, I said evenly. He understood something long before I did. Michael stared at me in confusion. Vanessa's expression changed instantly. Fear. Small but unmistakable. What does that mean? She asked carefully. I smiled faintly for the first time all night. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just peacefully. It means this conversation stopped being about my future a long time ago, I answered quietly. Now it is about yours. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after my words settled across the dining room. The only sound came from the soft crackling fireplace in the next room and the wind brushing snow against the windows outside. Vanessa stood frozen beside her chair, her expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. Michael looked completely drained, like a man suddenly forced to see years of his own silence reflected back at him all at once. Around the table, relatives avoided eye contact with one another while untouched dessert slowly melted beside coffee cups and folded napkins. It struck me then how strange family gatherings become once politeness finally breaks apart. People spend years protecting appearances until one honest moment exposes how fragile those appearances really were. Vanessa recovered first, though her voice sounded thinner now. You are trying to make us sound heartless, she said carefully. I looked at her calmly across the candlelit table. No, I replied softly. I am finally refusing to help you pretend anymore. Her jaw tightened immediately. Everything Michael and I discussed was practical. You are getting older, Evelyn. That is reality. I nodded once. Yes, I am older. I folded my hands gently together in my lap. But growing older does not make me invisible. It does not erase my memory. And it certainly does not give other people permission to slowly remove me from my own life while calling it concern. No one interrupted me this time. Not even Vanessa. I continued quietly because after years of swallowing words, the truth no longer felt frightening. I spent too much time trying to stay welcome in rooms where I was only tolerated as long as I stayed quiet. My voice never rose. It did not need to. Every joke, every holiday invitation that felt conditional, every conversation where I was spoken about instead of spoken to. I noticed more than you thought I did. Michael finally looked directly at me then, his eyes red around the edges. Mom, I never wanted you to feel unwanted. I held his gaze sadly. That may be true, but wanting something means very little when your actions repeatedly create the opposite. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, then stopped, because there was nothing left to defend. Olivia sat quietly beside me with tears gathering in her eyes, though she smiled faintly at the same time. Across the table, Greg Turner slowly closed his leather portfolio and stood awkwardly from his seat. I think perhaps this discussion should continue privately, he muttered uncomfortably before reaching for his coat near the entryway. Vanessa looked horrified watching him leave, because for the first time all evening, her carefully controlled environment had collapsed publicly. Not through screaming, not through scandal, through truth. Simple truth spoken out loud in front of witnesses. I reached calmly for my purse beside the chair and stood slowly from the table. Every eye followed me. For years I imagined that if I ever truly confronted my family, I would feel victorious afterward. But standing there beneath the warm Christmas lights while snow drifted outside, I mostly felt tired. Tired and strangely free. I picked up my coat carefully from the hallway chair, while Michael hurried after me toward the front door. "Mom, please do not leave like this," he said quietly. I turned toward him slowly. For the first time in years, I really looked at my son instead of the version of him I kept trying to preserve in my memory. He looked older than I realized. Worn down, ashamed, but also weak in ways that sadness alone could not explain. "You know the hardest part?" I asked softly. It was never Vanessa. He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I buttoned my coat carefully before answering. "I expected kindness from the woman I raised, not from the woman you married." His face crumpled slightly at that. "Mom," I shook my head gently. "I do love you, Michael. I probably always will. But love cannot survive indefinitely where respect no longer exists." Snow swirled softly through the porch light behind him while distant church bells rang somewhere across town announcing midnight mass. For one brief moment, Michael looked like the little boy who used to wait by the front window for me to come home from work. Then the moment passed. "What happens now?" he whispered. I thought about Thomas then, about the letter hidden in the photo album, about the trust documents resting safely in my dining room drawer, about all the years I confused silence with peace. "Now," I answered quietly, "I stop apologizing for taking up space in my own life." I stepped past him and onto the snowy porch before he could respond. Behind me, the house glowed warmly with Christmas lights and polished decorations, and people still sitting awkwardly around a table pretending not to hear everything that had finally been spoken aloud. But for the first time in years, walking away did not feel lonely. It felt honest. The drive home through falling snow felt strangely peaceful. Soft jazz played quietly through the car speakers while streetlights reflected gold against icy roads. When I finally stepped inside my house, warmth wrapped around me immediately. The Christmas tree still glowed softly in the living room corner beside Thomas's old recliner. I removed my coat slowly and stood there listening to the quiet. Not the painful quiet I used to dread after family gatherings. A different kind. A quiet without humiliation inside it. My phone buzzed once inside my purse while I hung my scarf by the door. A message from Olivia. "You were never unbearable. You were just surrounded by people who forgot how to deserve you." I read the message twice before smiling softly to myself. Then I placed the phone down, turned off the hallway light, and walked peacefully into the home my husband protected long before I learned how to protect myself.